Thank you everyone that is joining us for our 7th session of the DPU post-COVID series. Let me put this in full screen. So this is our 7th session of the post-COVID-19 Urban Future series of the Development Planning Unit of University College London. My name is Daniel Oviedo. I am a lecturer in Transport and Urban Development Planning at the DPU, and I'm chairing this webinar co-organized with Professor Caren Levy from the DPU as well, where we're going to have a wonderful roster of speakers addressing different issues about what are the responses to COVID-19, what challenges and prospects for urban transformation we have for that new normal that the pandemic has brought to us. We have a few speakers joining us from different institutions, so I'm going to read very quickly the list of speakers. We have Fatima Arroyo from the World Bank, where she works as urban transport specialist. We have Holger Dagman, who is senior advisor for the DFID High Volume Transport Project. We have Patricia Lynn Scholl, who is a senior transport specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Joseph McCarthy, who is a co-director of the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. We have Professor Gina Porter from Durham University, where she works mostly on issues about inequalities in transport in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have Juan Pablo Bocarejo, who is associate professor at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá and former urban mobility secretary for Bogotá. We have Rutul Joshi, associate professor at CEPT University, Ahmedabad, India. And last but not least, we have our own Caren Levy, who's going to be acting as commentator for the webinar. So without further ado, the way that the webinar is going to operate, we have 3 guiding questions that are going to structure our discussion. And the first one is thinking about that first part of our title. What are the actions, what are the responses that have been taken to COVID-19 in global South cities across Africa, Latin America, and Asia? And to what extent have they affected issues of accessibility and inequalities? And I would like to start giving the opportunity to Fatima to tell us a bit about, from her perspective in the World Bank, what has been happening in Sub-Saharan African cities. So Fatima.
Thank you, Daniel, and hello everybody. From the Africa perspective, actually, COVID has had a huge impact in people's mobility. I mean, we have already some numbers about the changes on mobility, and we see that changed a lot depending on the city in the continent. There are some countries that have been very restrictive, for example, South Africa and Zimbabwe, and where mobility has reduced around 80%. Other cities in countries such as Tanzania or Zambia, the reduction has been much less. But we have seen a huge impact in the quantity of trips, but also in the mode of trips. There has been a huge reduction in trips using public transport. So I think in general, all over the continent, the governments and cities have put in place preventive measures to respond to the spread of the disease in public transport. The African context is also a little bit particular in the sense that almost all the public transport is provided by the informal sector. So sometimes these preventive measures have been more or less successful to implement. The fact that it's an unregulated sector has been a little bit more difficult to implement in some cases. But we see that in most of the cities in the continent, the government and cities have been putting preventive measures such as use of masks, cleaning of vehicles. So in in some cases also they brought also, for example, in Dar es Salaam, they have been putting in place more strict queuing in stations and allowing certain distance between people. We have also seen actually certain in certain places that the cities has been encouraging the use of technology, for example, fare collection systems, cashless fare collection systems in Nairobi and in Mombasa. So this is something that also we see that COVID has been changing the way public transport is being operated. And also we have seen some cities in the continent that has been implementing certain measures to encourage cycling. There's just few cases actually in the African region. One of them is Addis. So we don't have a lot of examples, but we have some interesting examples on measures that have been implemented in urban mobility to respond to COVID. What actually we have seen it is that the countries that unfortunately suffered Ebola a few years back had been countries that have been able to respond very quickly to COVID, and countries as Liberia or Sierra Leone, and we have a colleague from Sierra Leone. Even when there was not any case in the country, they were able to mobilize people and create a huge awareness and involve communities to avoid any potential spread in the country. What we have not seen a lot in Africa, it is more like a medium or long-term plan from governments to respond to the recovery phase of COVID. So most of the responses have been more in the short term to control the spread of the disease, but not on the recovery phase. So this could be more in the first part of the question on what has been the measures put in place in the Africa region to respond to COVID. Regarding the second part of the question, that is how these measures have been affecting the issues of accessibility and inequalities in these cities. So what we have seen it is that in the short term, there has been a reduction of the supplies in public transport, and this is sometimes caused by the fact that there has been total stop of some of the services. For example, in Harare, where government totally stop or forbid operation of public transport. In other places, and in most of the cities, actually, it is because in order to protect the passengers and workers in the sector, the government have imposed a certain reduction of passenger per vehicle, so that in a way reduce the supply, which has an impact in the access for people who use public transport, who are usually the poor in the African context. We have some cases where actually there has been some reduction on fares, but this is more linked to the reduction in the fuel price rather than responding to COVID. So, but this kind of like reduction of fare is actually it has a positive impact for inclusion of the poor. I think another area that we have been discussing a lot at the World Bank, it's about where are kind of like the most vulnerable workers in the transport sector, and we identified in an African context are basically the drivers and the conductors that get that have the demand risk of trips, and due to the huge reduce of mobility, they have been having a lot of constraints for, in a way, surviving in a daily basis. So this is a group that also it is very much affected on much more at risk from a health point of view. So we see actually is a vulnerable group from an economic point of view, but also it's especially at risk at this point. So we have not seen a lot of programs in African cities to support these kind of workers, but there are a few cases such as in Ghana and in Addis where there has been some initiatives of putting in place funds, government funds to support through safety net programs. So I think that in general, and just to summarize what we see in the African context, we have seen actually a very proactive response from governments to respond on the short term to put in place preventive measures in public transport. There have been some challenges on the implementation of these measures due to the informality of the supply. There are few initiatives that are pretty encouraging and bring a lot of hopes, those regarding to non-motorized transport and use of technology in the sector that are actually interesting, and it would be interesting to see how that can actually help to shape these structural changes in the sector, and I think this is going to be something that is going to be discussed in the next question looking towards the future. And then we see in the short term there has been some impact for that exacerbates inequalities because there has been reducing of supplies of public transport, which has an impact in accessibility. But I think for me the big question is going to be more towards the future. What are going to be the structural changes in the sector, in urban mobility, in urban accessibility, and how governments are going to be able to incentivize this transition period to actually to get cities that are more inclusive. So I think that here urban transport have a very important role to play to bring cities in towards a more sustainable and inclusive future. So great. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thanks, Fatima. Great. So just to give a sense of the diversity of the different responses to COVID, I would like also to invite Ruth to give us a brief overview of what's happening in India in response to the pandemic.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful webinar. I'm very glad because, while doing my PhD a few years back, I read some of these people as authors. So I'm glad to be part of this. Very quickly, what's going on in India? Well, I think we, as a country, we declared a lockdown on 22nd of March onwards. And I think since then, it's been 2.5 months and the lockdown is slowly easing up, but the numbers of the coronavirus cases are increasing every day. So we're not really anywhere close to the controlling or flattening the curve, as they say. But I think what happened immediately, and so what I'll do is I'll talk about the short term and then a bit in the long term. So what happened immediately is that everybody was asked to stay where they were. And in India, most of our cities are also sort of majority of the population is of people who work on daily basis or people who have a very meager savings. And because of which what happened was that all the people who were daily wage workers or people who were working in informal sector, unorganized sort of jobs, factories, etc., they were started to feel the distress of the lockdown immediately. Many of them sort of started walking back home, covering hundreds and in some cases thousands kilometers. I mean, a lot of that is sort of covered in the international news, so I'm not going in this. But today, I think apparently there was a news story which says that how many people are we talking about? So probably anywhere between 50 to 100 million people who had to sort of go through this distress and probably find their way back home is what we are talking about. So, I mean, that immediately that was a bit of a tragedy, almost at the level of a great scale, and we have not really been able to sort of, recognize the contribution of the migrant worker in urban economy at one level, but also at the other level, we sort of denied the right to the city, if you like. And what's going to happen is if they're going to go back to the villages, by the time they come back to the city, It's going to take time. The economy is going to shrink, and we'll have a huge impact on the way in which the cities are. So I think that is something that could have been avoided or at least better managed immediately. But I think some of the positive stories are coming from the public transport operators in India, is that they immediately started running the public transport in few cities like Mumbai and Bangalore, at least for the frontline workers, the medical staff, etc. But that was sort of the immediate effect. At the longer, in sort of long term, the India's urban transport sector faces many challenges. One, because we have a very skewed priority in terms of where we are putting our money and infrastructure into. Because if you look at the census figure, first time in the history of post-independent India in 2011, we asked the question related to transport. And that's the data we have, and in which we find that we have only 16% of urban workers using private transport, and 3% car, and 16% motorized two-wheelers. A lot of people use walking, cycling, even 11% uses buses. And if you look at the amount of public transport investment that is taking place in India, are majority in the metro and heavy rail, especially in last 5-6 years. And then what happened is that over a period of time, the bus-based public transport has suffered. The bus numbers are depleting continuously. And if you have a sort of conservative number of, let's say, 500 buses per million population, I don't think that any of those top 10, 20 cities in India would be able to come close to that number of about 500 buses per million population. So I think what we need to do in India is immediately try and pump in some money in the bus-based public transport, because buses are used mainly by low-income groups, by socially vulnerable groups massively. Many of the metro rail fares are not really affordable to daily commuters and the daily wage workers. The second area where we required a lot of attention immediately would be a non-motorized transport, because traditionally we say that in Indian cities, 1/3 of the trips belong to non-motorized transport. So we need to sort of make walkable footpaths is, as straightforward as that, to sort of promote cycling, build cycling friendly infrastructure in few of the arterial roads, if not everywhere. So those are the challenges which we are facing. And at the same time, the kind of noise that I hear from media and other places, there is one magazine which is a bit more ideologically inclined, but where I read an article which said that, shouldn't India should become a car country after defeating coronavirus. It was a funny article in that sense, because there's no logic to it. But you can imagine from 3% car to, and that was being given as a sort of booster dose to, promote economic growth in Indian cities. And if that is to happen, then we are really in deep trouble, given the air pollution and road fatality rates, etc. So the point is that the lockdown and this particular pandemic has increased the inequality, or I would say unequal access to urban amenities, jobs, livelihood to a great deal. And I think Indian cities will require healing. And while you do this healing in many more months to come, we have to focus on the modes of transport that larger part of the city can use very easily. So we need sort of lot of institutional, regulatory, financial reform in promoting bus-based public transport and integrating it with metro rail, because it is increasingly recognized that metro rail itself cannot solve all your transport problem on one side. And secondly, take the non-motorized transport very, very seriously and make massive investment in urban road infrastructure which support walking and cycling. Yeah. So I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rutul. Thanks, and thanks for sticking to time so disciplinedly. So we have heard from Africa, we've heard from India. I think to complete our picture, it would be good to hear from Latin America. And for that, I would like to invite Linsho from IDB to give us a quick overview.
Everybody, thank you so much, Daniel, for the invitation. I think a lot of what we're seeing in Latin America is similar to what we heard from the prior two speakers, what's happening in Africa and other developing countries. In Latin America, urban mobility has been greatly impacted by the coronavirus. Prior to the virus, we had more than half of the people relying on public transport to travel each day, with over almost 300 million daily trips. With lockdowns and the pandemic, we've seen a major decline. It varies by country and by city, but overall we've seen declines of up to 75% in ridership, which has had not only a big impact on passengers, but also on operators, which depend mostly on fare revenue. So we've seen a decline on average of 116% in revenue. And we estimate per month about $12 million US per month per 1,000 inhabitants in the region. So this is a major crisis, not only for mobility for vulnerable populations, but also for the operators that serve the trips that vulnerable populations and others take. We've been doing a number of things at the IDB related to COVID, including a number of surveys, regional policy dialogues. I wanted to focus, given the time, on some results that we have from a survey that we conducted in collaboration with Move It. This was an effort led by Carlos Mojica and Christian Naves that I worked on with them together and other specialists at the IDB. And the results of the survey are quite interesting because they demonstrate some of the early impacts that we're seeing on accessibility and mobility, particularly for lower income groups which depend on public transport. With Move It, we implemented a short survey through their app, and we collected responses in 9 countries, and we had 33,000 responses. And some of the major findings that we see are that even in the lockdown, even though mobility has declined by around 75%, over half of the respondents who use the app stated that they use public transport in the week prior. A large majority of those, up to 75 or 73%, were actually from the lower 2 income segments. And most of those trips were to get to work. So we see that this is an essential mode for those people that still need to work despite the risks of the pandemic. And some of the things that they've been seeing, we asked for the perceptions on the quality of service, and a majority of them reported some type of deterioration in service in terms of less frequent service, canceled routes. And so getting around during this time has not been easy for this population. And I just turning back a little bit to what have been the impacts on the finances of the operators, we can see that it's very important for this segment of the population that's depending on public transport, even in the lockdown stages of the pandemic. The operators are under huge financial strain, yet it's even more critical that they are implementing sanitation measures. And another thought that I wanted to implement to emphasize is that this is a window of opportunity. It's very important that there are financial packages to rescue operators in this time. We see that of the higher income groups in the survey, many of them stated that, or a small portion of them stated that they would not go back to public transport, even though they had used public transport before. And we see a risk here that for an increase in motorization in the long run. So it's even more critical, as other speakers have mentioned, to invest in non-motorized transport, to develop rescue packages for the public transport industry, to more than ever increase the space for bicycling and walking, as we're seeing in many cities in Latin America. So I think I'll close with that, but I think there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of opportunities to promote more sustainable transport.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And I think now we're having a clear picture of what's happening globally in our global south cities. And just to give a brief wrapping up of this first question, I wanted to invite Holger, who is an advisor for DFID's HVT program, which have looked at many cities in the global south, especially in Africa.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. So thanks also for the invite. After we heard from Africa, after we heard from India, after we heard also from Lynn, probably want to share also just some global observations more. So being based here in Berlin, so you know far better so now so what's going on the ground. However, we have one of the pieces of work I've done in the last 2 months was looking into the responses from international stakeholders, and I'm happy also to share also later so the link. One of the findings is actually to answer your question straight in terms of what are the effects in terms of accessibility and inequality. I would say we don't know. So we have also some data there, we have also some countries are doing better, but overall also the information when it comes also to beyond also specific transport data, we hardly have any socioeconomic data, we have hardly any information also on gender impact. And so first message I would say we still is lacking in general so on the data issue, and that's also not just a problem is on COVID, but that's also a problem is in general. And I would argue there it's another reason also to also improve also the way also we collect data and also make it also far more accessible. So in that respect, I think we still also need to know more. However, I see also some anecdotal evidence and partially repeating also what had been said. What is interesting from my perspective, particularly Asia and Africa, were relatively earlier, so it was a lockdown, and so far so responded also in that respect also better in terms of lower cases. However, we see also the socioeconomic impact, particularly so on the most vulnerable one. Again, also was great also that Lynn shared also some of the survey there, but partially also we don't know. One of the elements I picked up and we picked up in the last weeks, and which wasn't really shared so far, is also the issue of food supply. Food supply in two ways. One is so some of the there was no cross-border trade any longer in some, particular in Africa, which also led to some of the challenges. The other is in fact also providing also food to the disabled people, so people who can't actually access to the market. So here we've seen innovative ways of using also informal transport, also providing also food supply, like with in Botswana, in Bangladesh, for example. There was a GIZ-funded project on e-rickshaws. Also there also had then a new business also providing also food. So here we have also seen different responses. Same also, and we talk later about the 15-minute city, is South Africa, for example, also moved also to providing us a far more very local food markets. So here that people also don't have to travel also so far and have access. We heard about also the issue of the informal transport. Obviously, drivers who often also are individual operators also are hugely affected. But then also what I heard more, and again, there's some more anecdotal evidence in terms of trying also to implement physical distance, but then also by increasing also the prices to recover. So therefore, a challenge we have even also in bad weather conditions. But here again, there's a lack of often of regulation of the sector. So is showing again there's a negative impact here, and lots of people are also relying on that. Last point, and I'm glad that we will hear so later from Pablo. I think we have seen in Latin America a lot on the pop-up bike lanes and and public space, and that's fantastic. As Fatima said, we so far, and also Ruchel, so far we have seen only a little bit of that also in India, in Asia, and in Africa. And I would argue it's less about also the ability of infrastructure, but about leadership. So in Uganda, for example, the president also said, this is the safest mode. This is also what we also need to do. And what I heard also from Kampala is, in fact, also now also far more people also taking also bikes. So, but I would be also interesting also to have that discussion. Is that a regional phenomena, or is that still also an opportunity also to pick up? I know, Ruchel, that in Bangalore, for example, they're trying also to come up with that. But again, also it's probably interesting also to look also into the difference. So really also to sum up, I would also highlight the need also for using that momentum again and again, and we're all involved in the transport, and we can't just repeat in terms of, or we have to repeat, data is crucial, but also more specific policy frameworks which really fits also into the local situation, particularly as Fatima and Lynn also highlighted around us, the stimulus packages. And here would end. So that's in fact also the opportunity, but also the challenge, how to get out of that, with also the need also for people going back to work and making that also more aligned also with the SDGs and climate.
Thank you, Holger. And I think this is the perfect segue to our second guiding question in the discussion, and is thinking a bit more about those issues that have emerged around public transport, both formal and informal, recognizing that in many contexts, informal transport plays the main role in getting people to their jobs, to other opportunities, social and cultural. So what changes are likely to take place in informal and informal public transport systems, not just during, but also after the pandemic, and what other transformations can we see in that future post-COVID? And for that, I would like to first give Juan Pablo the opportunity to give us a brief reflection from his perspective. Juan, you're mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, Caren, for inviting me to this webinar. Very interesting now to think about how we can improve things and also how we can prevent to get things worse. We started the lockdown in Bogota, in Colombia, middle March, and it has been strong and I think very effective. So far, we have like 1,300 deaths from coronavirus. We're restarting activities now. So let me show you something we are doing, for example, in Bogota, following what happens in public transport. So this is the dashboard, the web page from Transmilenio, and you can see almost in real time how is the ridership in the system. So we have a very strong restriction is we cannot go up to 35% of occupation. And well, that poses a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, especially to the poor people. We are trying to give more importance and more space in the street to bicycle. We already have a very good bicycle network in the city, and it was extended with 80 additional kilometers that were taken from some of the more important roads in Bogota. So we were having, before the pandemic, almost 1.2 million trips in bicycle per day. And we think that when all the activities restart again. And with this 35% limit in public transport ridership, that bicycle will go a lot better. The other key aspect we are looking for is road safety. We have, of course, a strong reduction on fatalities, about a third of what we had in a normal month. But we also have a new problem, and it is speeding. Mayor of Bogota put a regulation like 1 month ago that all streets should have 50 kilometer per hour speed limit. That is a very interesting decision in terms of protecting life. So we have these good changes that are taking place. A very one that I think is very important is trying to convince the economic activities to change how they used to get to work. So what we are proposing is that different sectors start their work at different times. We have a very strong peak hour. I don't know if you could see it in the graphics I showed you from Transmilenio, but almost 50% of the people are in the public transport just in the peak hours, in 4 hours. It is a very strong peak hour, and it causes a lot of congestion, and of course, it is a risk for contagion. So one thing we would like to change is how we use the streets, how we use the public transport. But definitely the big challenge now, the big headache is public transport. The poor people in Bogota, 40% walks to work. Already 10 to 12% goes by bicycle, and almost 40% uses public transport. And it's very long ride. It's long journeys that sometimes cannot be made by bicycle. So this is the real challenge. It is very difficult to have a long-term decision to cut public transport to 35%, because you are affecting a lot of people, and we don't have the capacity unless we start buying motorcycles or getting decisions that will put us in struggle in terms of sustainability and environment. So this is really a big challenge for the poor people, and I think we need to see ways to restart public transport. We are also having big problems with the finance of the public transport. This year, for example, in Bogota, we will have to pay probably $500 million additionally in order to operate this system, because we won't have the fares for the financing. And we have in the country a lot of companies that depend on the passengers. So they will just get 35% at max of the revenue that they were having last year, and that will put them in a lot of financial struggle.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Very valuable contributions. I would like to also shift our attention to contexts where perhaps informal or semi-formal public transport play a much larger role than in cities that have gone through transformation, such as Bogota. And here I wanted to ask Joseph for some insights about what's happening with public transport in Freetown in Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks to everyone for listening. Just to start by saying that Sierra Leone was one of the last countries in West Africa to experience the COVID, and therefore it provided a lot of opportunity for the government to prepare towards it. And therefore, a range of measures were taken to deal with the epidemic, but mostly they were very much restrictive. Like Fatima said, much of the actions, the response actions were a lot short-term. But then there is the reality that during pandemic like COVID, the public transport sector is generally considered as one of the high-risk environments for transmission. But then the reality in Sierra Leone is that the public transport sector is a lot informal, and it's really very difficult to regulate, which provides a lot of challenge. But then in terms of answering this question, in terms of the kinds of actions to expect during and after the epidemic, one thing is certain, that even with the COVID, the issue of safety and well-being is something that is going to be very difficult to ignore. And so therefore, even post-COVID, safety and well-being issues is going to be very, very critical. It is going to be a new normal. And so therefore, the question could be, what can be done to ensure that safety and well-being of passengers and the operators becomes a very key issue for consideration as part of the changes. But then it's so much also about how can we, in doing this, maintain the functioning of the public transport systems during and after the pandemic. So with regards to this, I think some of the changes that will be expected are possibly the issue of personal protection and hygiene measures. I think will have to continue to be applied regardless of whether or not there is COVID or whether or not the risk level increases. And I also want to believe that another change will be that we'll have to maintain and endure with this issue of cleaning routines, especially in terms of disinfecting as well as safely disposing the waste, especially in terms of the public transport. There is also the need for us to introduce as well as maintain issues about reducing contact. What kind of measures are we likely to bring about, especially in terms of the use of passengers? Here in Sierra Leone, there is already the issue of e-passes and tickets issuance, especially to the public. We also consider that the issue of reducing the maximum number of passengers per vehicle is going to remain a very key issue, because even after COVID, I think we have to be very careful, especially in terms of how to reduce overcrowding in the public transport. And it's also about how do we ensure propagation the means of transport that we use. But then also, beyond the issue of safety and well-being and how do we maintain the functioning of the public transport systems, I think there is also the question of how do we continue to focus on issues of reducing congestion and travel time. And therefore, issues about how do we encourage mass transit in our own parts of the world, especially those that prioritize public bus lanes, but also allow bicycling, is going to be a lot critical. But at the same time, it's also about how do we ensure transit access, especially for those who may want to walk to the transit points. But at the same time, it's a question of how do we reform our cities, especially in ways that can ensure inclusiveness. And this also raises the question of compactness, the kind of planning we might want to prioritize. With regards the question of inequalities, I think one of the key issues that have been brought to the fore, especially with regards reduction in the number of people per vehicle, has been the fact that the public transport has become a lot less profitable, especially to drivers and vehicle owners. And so therefore, there are fewer people that are willing to invest in public transport. And this particular norm is going to progress possibly into the future. And what this means on the ordinary person, especially the urban poor, is the issue of high transport costs and also disruptions in their livelihood systems. And to the drivers, of course, who are involved in this sector, issues of unemployment is going to remain a very big challenge. And so therefore, for most of the drivers, in order to break even in terms of cost, they have tended to resort to short distances. And this makes long distance travelers, this comes with a cost to long distance travelers. It creates an extra burden on them, especially for the cost that they'll have to pay to cover longer distances, either to go to work or to do whatever. And also, there is also going to be another problem, especially for informal settlements. The new reality is that because of the additional costs to cover long distances, it is becoming increasingly difficult to access hard-to-reach areas in the city. And these are areas where we have informal settlements, especially the hillside settlements, which are mostly rugged, which are mostly unplanned, and which are mostly poor in terms of infrastructure. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for their own livelihood systems. And the critical issue there is going to be issues about security and safety, especially for women and girls who live in these hard-to-reach areas. It's so much a question of how are those particular places going to be easily accessed by such people. But like Holger also mentioned, there is also the issue of the availability of locally produced goods, especially so when, as a result of inter-district lockdown measures being imposed by the government, issues about the availability of locally produced goods that used to be brought from the provinces. It's becoming a lot more a challenge, especially given that to secure such foodstuff now is becoming is coming at a cost, which is the high prices that are associated with it. So in order not to go too much into detail, I think this is so much what I think is going to be the kinds of changes that we'll have to expect, especially as a result of the pandemic and even after.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Joseph. Great contribution so far. And for just to bring to a close this second question before I give Caren a space for reflecting about the idea of the 15-minute city, I wanted to invite Gina to give us a perspective on those inequalities, particularly on children and women that Joseph was just mentioning.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you, and hello, everybody. So I'm going to just talk about work really that we've been doing over the last 18 months and we're still trying to do in the peripheral areas of 3 African cities. That's Tunis, Abuja, and Cape Town. And we've been working with young women to look at how they actually get to work or don't get to work, can't get to any work. And key really with our work has been going together with young women in some of these communities, training them as co-researchers. And because of COVID, we've had to stop all our face-to-face work, but we're trying to keep some information collection in each of our peripheral research sites, and they're on our website. I think, Daniel, you've got the website slide there that you
I just shared it in the chat for everyone.
Right, great, thank you. So, I mean, essentially, these are 3 quite different cities. They're different in terms of cultures, politics, economics, COVID context even. But arguably, I suppose they're all situated in sort of neoliberalizing economic development contexts. They've got peri-urban areas that have been starved of jobs, starved of services, including transport services, for a long time. And so informal transport dominates in all these cities in these peripheral areas, right on the edge, just inside or just outside the city boundary. And precarity also dominates. It's a tough life for people living there. Income sparse, it's uncertain, it's irregular, it's unreliable. For operators of transport, various transport modes, but also for users of transport modes. And what's happened with COVID, of course, is that, yes, governments put in regulation, but people are in a difficult situation. So inevitably, they sideline the regulations. So operators of, the collective taxis in Tunis, the Anapela in the Cape Town townships, the Okada in Abuja, they've got to continue. Workers have got to continue. And they struggle. In South Africa, you've got supposed to have 70% loading capacity. There's a sanitizer issue and all of that. Where do you keep buying your sanitizer? Can you afford it? At the same time, you've got the commuters. If you've got a job, you then have still got to try to get to work. And of course, it's increasingly the case that other people in your household haven't got jobs because of COVID. And therefore, you're trying to support more people. It's a really tough situation, which is what we hear from our peer researchers, and we have our RAs who are also resident in some of these more difficult, deprived areas. So what's happening as lockdown eases? Fare price hikes. I got an email from Bolt again this morning telling me that I will get a 10% reduction on my fare if I use them for so many journeys. But actually, for the taxi services, prices are increasing, and that's just the Bolt services, the Uber, are really not focused on the very poorest locations where we're working. In South Africa, the National Taxi Association's talking about 172% fare increase in Gauteng. In Abuja, we're hearing about prices rising. And obviously, this is a very difficult situation then. For commuters in peri-urban areas, most of them are going to be going long distances to work, and they're going to bear the brunt of these rises. But I think it's especially women who are going to bear the brunt. Women as users are more dependent, for a start, on public transport. If they're not likely to have a private car, more men are likely to have private cars. When they go for transport, if the seat reduction numbers are in place, then they're going to be fighting to get into those seats with men. More likely, taxis will continue to be packed. I mean, this is what we're hearing across the board. Women tend to be really worried because, but they won't say anything. Nobody, or only a few women, are more likely to wear masks, but most people will not be wearing masks. You're crowded into the vehicle, and of course, the COVID risks will persist, and they're going to persist for a good time in these sorts of situations. And so users are really disadvantaged, but women users in these peripheral areas particularly disadvantaged. But women working in the informal transport sector are also going to struggle. They're more likely to lose their jobs. They're more likely to find it difficult, if they're driving a taxi, for instance, to deal with the regulators, the police who stop them, the hassle at the bus stops, and so on, at the taxi stops. The one interesting area, I think, is in the formal sector, where when regulations are applied and you've got lower occupancy, I'm just wondering whether there will be less sexual harassment reported. And that could be very interesting. In Tunis, where a lot of women do take jobs that aren't really the sort of jobs they would want, or they do no work, because sexual harassment is such a massive issue on public transport. During the lockdown, the government made transport free for essential workers. To what extent that reduced number of people using public transport, because you've got to prove that you were a public sector worker, to what extent that actually reduced sexual harassment, it will be very interesting to know. We probably won't be able to get a clear picture of that, but yeah. So overall, it looks difficult going forward. I mean, I think the stories that we've heard so far, I mean, particularly Sierra Leone, I can see that when countries are in difficult situations, funding public transport is going to get more difficult. In the peripheral areas where the informal sector dominates, it's getting increasingly hard for operators to stay in business. It's very difficult to see what can be done. I think more attention needs certainly to be paid to gender post-COVID, and this is something that certainly all the collaborators, in-country collaborators in our project are talking about. The concern that actually there will be more marginalisation of women going further, and women will suffer both as users and as transport sector employees. Very, very complex situation. I think, again, what Holger said about lack of data is a massive concern. We've been working, doing a lot of very in-depth qualitative research. We don't have the numbers, but I would argue that actually going forward, it won't be just numbers that matter. As always, it's really understanding what the numbers mean. And it's that qualitative understanding of what it means for people's well-being that is really part of what we've got to be picking up going forward.
Thanks, Gina. Sorry to cut off. Since we started a couple of minutes late, I think we can take ourselves and please feel free to stick to the broadcast for a few more minutes. I just wanted to give Caren the opportunity to wrap up these very exciting discussions, especially from that perspective of our current concern about local access and many of the rhetorics that have started coming across in practice about an idea of a 15-minute city, in a city that is accessible locally, and what would that mean for transport justice in global South cities? So Caren, we're with you.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. I think what's important about thinking about the future and a possible alternative vision for cities is just, I thought it useful just to start with some of the framing of the present response, because I think people have actually put things in a context which I think is very useful for us to think about as a starting point. First of all, what we've heard about is an impact on not just transport users, but also transport operators, and also on the goods that is transported in the city, which Holger and Joseph also talked about, and their knock-on effect on food, but also a whole range of other commodities. And when we talk about transport users, we've really focused in on the impact on on people with precarious livelihoods, the impact in terms of differential modes and fares, and affecting access, and also the very important issue of the social identity of those users, the intersection of class and gender, and many other social identities that would be important in different places in the city. And also I think that the discussion is focused on the importance of the location of where people are in cities. The most obvious one being the city centre or the peri-urban, but people talked about hillsides, they talked about different of the city, which I think is also very in this. So, impact of COVID, we need to have this more holistic view of what's happened. And I think what people have also pointed to are some very worrying trends on the more negative side. The increase in motorization, which Lynn and Ratul pointed to in different contexts. And also, I think, although we didn't quite say it in so many words, but I think we're also seeing that, in a sense, this experience is also may become an excuse for stigmatizing informal settlements and informal transport, which could be very worrying, given the importance of that to so many people living in informal settlements and relying on informal transport in cities. And of course, the final point I wanted to pick up here is the ambivalence of public transport in all of this, in the pandemic and what's happened to it in terms of its use, its financing, the management, the control of it. And in a way, all of us have been involved in one way and another in promoting public transport as a response to a more sustainable transport system and a more sustainable city. And now we're sitting with this dilemma of a public transport system that's really taken a very bad knock in this situation. And we need to be thinking very carefully about how to manage that. And I think what I also heard from people is that in all of this, of course, most of our transport systems operate in public spaces. And the way in which we deal with public space in the city, and Gina's discussion about safety, security in public spaces, and how that's changed in the COVID era, or perhaps it has, or perhaps it hasn't, and what that means for the future. And so when talking about the alternative vision, how do we take this? What are the trends that we can take to think about this? I suppose what is concerning, what I could hear is a lot of short-term responses, but as Fatima said, perhaps not so much longer-term thinking. And so some people began to talk about some possible reimagining of the city. And I suppose when we do that, we really need to start thinking about what kind of city are we talking about? A city where all who live in that city have a right to that city, a decent life in that city, and actually also have a right to be part of the discussions and the decisions about that future city. So on the one hand, I would say we have a politics around that future city. And on the other hand, we also have the need to deeply question our traditional assumptions about the relationships between transport, land use, densities, economic development, the environment. And I think that this is a good time not just to rethink the cities, but also to rethink our theories. And as some of you have very clearly pointed out, the methodologies that we use to address these questions, and methodologies and the kinds of data, qualitative and quantitative, that we're using. It seems that basically the crisis is provoking people to think locally. And of course, there's a long tradition of local development and the older discussions of the norms related to local development, the easy access to basic necessities for a decent life. And I think, though, we need to be careful in this discussion, because of course it's not necessarily a panacea for all the city's challenges. Local development can still be riven with inequalities. Indeed, it could entrench spatial segregation in cities. And so we do need to think about what we mean by local development and whose local development, and what that implications are for class, for gender, for the social relations that we've raised. And in this discussion, there's no doubt about it that the role of technology is going to play have important part in this discussion, but exactly in what way? What kind of, are we still talking about the same sort of smart city discussion that we were having before the pandemic? And so I think there's a whole area of work there around the role of technology in this alternative vision of a city. And I would say that one of the important things to think about is in this is not to make local development a kind of utopia for the future city, because what I think we need to understand is what can be local and what needs to be citywide, and what is the impact on that on governance and leadership. I think the issue of leadership, which was raised in our discussion, is very important. And what does it mean for the finance and planning of a transport system to respond to that vision? So in the end, I think we're coming to a point where we're talking about something that's really quite deeply political. No matter what kind of system we're talking about, no matter what kind of city, what kind of transport to support that kind of city, in the end, we're talking about the role of participation in the future vision of the city. And in a way, perhaps that's really one of the biggest challenges for traditional transport planning, is how to be more responsive and more interactive in relation to the needs and the demands and the realities of people's lives in the city. And I'd like to leave it there. I know I've left it as a very open agenda. I think something like a 15-minute city is a very attractive kind of slogan, and it holds many promises, but I don't think it's straightforward. And I think it also raises many, many questions that I've tried to raise in my summary. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Caren, and thank you everyone for such a fantastic conversation. We have cheekily gone over the allocated time, but I would like to be even more cheeky and go to 1 hour and 15 minutes time. So I will take these last 5 minutes to give each of the speakers 30 seconds, which I'm going to be very stern about, to give a final remark. And I'm just going to call you one by one in no particular order, but that as you appear in my screen. So Holger, I would like to start with you. 30 seconds, something that you want to share from these reflections.
Sure. Just also to add another question to end with, I saw today a post also from the transport minister in Singapore highlighting also that there is actually there's evidence also that it's more it's actually more challenging also to meet as a people in households than actually being with a mask on public transport. So as we discuss all the impact around public transport and how important it is, I also just wonder, are we having enough evidence also to question also and the current responses also against public transport? So I think we need here again also an evidence. So that's just another source where I would be greater if anybody also has studies to really also make the proof that with masks on public transport without speaking to anybody has really this major effect, because that would also be one of the things which also would then also influence also how we will respond in the future.
Thanks, Holger. Rutul, 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. So let me say that I live in a 15-minute city right now, and I really hope that it remains 15 minutes in a time to come. But the point that I want to make is, I think Caren talked about local development and Holger talked about data. I think at the interface of both is, I think I would really like to know from Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, about things that worked in those local contexts, some experience sharing, some key levers which were applied, whether it was in form of institutional working or capacity or financial mechanism or something else, something that worked during this time. And if we can sort of make use of that and learn from it, that kind of experience sharing, ideas that clicked, ideas that worked, that would be wonderful, actually, to sort of do a documentation of that kind of experience sharing.
Excellent. Thanks, Rutul. Joseph, one final comment.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I'll just possibly share the same perspective with the earlier speaker, especially with Caren, especially in terms of how do we really, what kind of considerations do we have in terms of fostering a kind of new reality that relates to the new models of development that we really desire for our own parts of the world. Because the reality is that we are at different stages of development, and so therefore there is so much in diversity in terms of context, and even in terms of the manner in which we are impacted by the COVID is really so much different as well. There are a lot of differences, especially in terms of the governance systems, the leadership systems, the financing systems. But that is not an excuse, especially in terms of not having a sustainable and functional system of mobility. So therefore, I think we have a key challenge to ensure that this becomes actionable.
Thanks, Joseph. Gina, one final thought.
Right, well, yeah. I suppose COVID has really brought public transport to the heart of the urban debate. And I think it would be great if we can keep it there. I think it's so often been at the periphery of debates about urban change. So let's seize the moment.
Excellent. Thanks, Gina. Juan Pablo, one final thought.
Yeah, I would also focus on the opportunities. First, I think we need a new balance in public transport. This is an opportunity to provide better public transport. We have this dilemma, I like the word, the dilemma on public transport is probably one of the main challenges in the middle term. And second, we need to improve bicycle and other environmentally friendly modes of transport.
I think we lost Juan Pablo for a moment. Let's see if his connection comes back so he can finish his thought. In the meantime, Fatima, would you like to give a final remark?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so I think that we are in a disruptive period, and there are, as it is, we see that there are threats for the inequality in cities, and we see also that there are opportunities. So I think now it is the moment, I think, to try to join forces, different stakeholders from international organizations, academia, governments, etc., to push for for this transition to be to be positive for cities and for the most vulnerable in cities. And I'm thinking in particular in the African context, where already the most vulnerable are extremely penalized in terms of access to jobs and services. And this transition needs to be properly incentivized, otherwise things are going to get worse.
Great, thanks Fatima. Juan Pablo, I'll give you the last moment later after Lynn. So Lynn, could you please give us your final reflection?
Sure. I wanted to raise a question about public transport finance. Given that we see that there is a great decline in revenue for public transport, especially in the Latin American region, where the systems are designed to be oftentimes mostly self-sustaining on fare revenue, and at the same time, greater cost in terms of sanitation needs, social distancing, so fewer passengers per vehicle. And so how can, and then third, we have a huge economic recession as a result of COVID. And so how can we think of new systems in terms of transport finance? Should we start to think more in terms of congestion pricing? Do people think, I know this is the end, so you don't have a chance to respond, but maybe this is an opportunity to propose pricing and systems, congestion pricing, which in the past has been politically less feasible, but now that more and more people may want to move towards motorized private forms of transportation, such as motorcycles and private cars, maybe this is the time to start thinking about taxing the unsustainable modes in order to help rescue our more sustainable modes, such as public transport and non-infrastructure for non-motorized transport, as well as subsidies for purchasing more sustainable modes like bicycles, electric scooters, and so forth. So just as a last thought, how can we start to rethink our structures for transportation finance?
Great, thanks, Jane. Juan Pablo, you got cut off when you were speaking about bicycles, so if you want to finish your thought, now's the time.
Yeah, no, just seize the opportunity to change how we distribute the public space and how we give more space to more sustainable modes like bicycle, like walking. We're doing it in Bogota, and I think it's working very good. And a lot of people is changing the way they move around the city these days.
Thanks, and thank you everyone once again, all of those who joined us and stayed with us until this slightly elongated time for the webinar. I think just to close, this is an opportunity to rethink about how can we transform urban mobility in our cities, despite our differences, there is a common call for increasing transport equity, affordability, and inclusion, especially for those that are most vulnerable, including women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities. And I think that we are now in a momentous time when we have such fantastic people as we have exemplified in this webinar, working towards that same goal of a more sustainable and inclusive public transport, and to encourage everyone that's still listening to us to also join that effort and keep working towards a more inclusive and transformative urban mobility. So with that, I just wanted to say thanks again to everyone that joined the webinar, and to let you know that our recording will be available in the DPU website, and we'll also share, if every speaker is happy with that, the contact link, so all those side conversations that couldn't be completely finished in the Q&A can be addressed individually. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in the next webinar session of our post-COVID series.